Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and in this presentation we're going to be covering the principle of specificity and how this relates to the transfer of training to sport performance. So first we need to understand what we mean by specificity, and essentially when we relate this to sport performance training, the adaptation that we get is specific to the training that we perform. So in other words, you get better at what you train for. So if you practice running the 100 meters, you get better at running the 100 meters. If you practice doing bench press, you get better at doing the bench press. So specificity comes in various forms. So training that we do can be specific to our sport event in many different ways. So we first have the physical side, which is mostly what we think of with athletic training. So an exercise can have specificity in regards to force requirements, velocity, so the speed at which we do the exercise, the force vectors, so the direction that we apply the force, the movement pattern, so what muscle groups, what joints are involved, also the skill of the sport, which is interrelated with the movement patterns, and then also energy systems, so which energy systems we're using during this sporting event. The other side of specificity is the cognitive element, and this is essentially referring to the stimuli that are presented. So the stimuli can be specific to the sporting event as well. Is the stimulus something visual that we see and react to? Is it something that we hear and react to? What are the number of the stimuli? Are there other people involved that could potentially create an action that therefore changes your decision making? So there's a million different stimuli, and this is going to be specific to the sport. And this is essentially what allows players to be smart on the field by making quick decisions. So they're going to perform a physical task quickly in response to many stimuli. So when we practice and get better at an exercise, we also have transfer to other exercises. And the more specific or the more similar they are, based on the previous factors we just discussed, the more transfer it will have to an exercise. So for example, if we increase our back squat 1RM by 10%, which is quite a substantial increase, we may get a 5% increase in our front squat 1RM. So although we increase 10% in our back squat, the front squat is a very similar exercise, but it's not exactly the same. Therefore, we're not going to have 100% transfer. We may also get a 2.5% increase to our vertical jump, because again, they are somewhat similar movements and there's going to be some transfer, but because they are not exactly the same exercise, we're never going to have 100% transfer. So just because our back squat increases 10%, our vertical jump won't increase 10%. And then our 30-meter sprint time may increase by 1.25% if we're lucky. That's probably being generous. Because again, there's going to be quite a substantial difference between the force production, velocity, the force vector, and the skill of a back squat in comparison to a 30-meter sprint. So the point to illustrate here is that we get better at the exercise we perform, and then the more similar other exercises are to that, we may get some transfer to those exercises. So by the sounds of it, it seems like if we want to get better at a sport or an exercise, we should simply just do that exercise in the exact same way that we want to get better at it. However, this isn't exactly true. The issue with always performing the exact exercise we want to get better at is that we have this principle of diminishing returns. So basically, any exercise we do, the longer we do it, the less return we get. And so eventually performance will plateau. So we may initially get some good adaptations from that exercise and improve quite quickly, but then over time, eventually we start to stagnate and fail to further improve our performance. So for example, if we were to throw a javelin and that was our sport, if we always tried to throw the javelin of the competition weight as far as we could every single time we trained, eventually we'd get quite efficient at it and we may improve the distance that we throw quite quickly, but then after a little while of doing that same exercise all the time, we will fail to improve very much more. And this will actually happen quite quickly. It may only take a few months for us to plateau. So the rest of our training career, what do we then do? That's where the exercises that transfer to our sporting performance come into play. So we want to do enough general training or exercises that transfer to sport performance in order to avoid those diminishing returns with the competition exercise. However, we don't want to do so much general training and not enough specific training that we actually lose our performance of our specific sporting event. So here are some examples of how we can balance our general and specific training. So in this example here, this could be an athlete who doesn't have a very big general training base, and therefore, although they do a lot of specific training, their peak of the pyramid can only reach so high because this base isn't quite as big as it could be. So even if they do a lot of specific training, they can get the most out of this general training, but it's still going to limit them eventually. Whereas this athlete here has a very large general training base, but probably hasn't done enough specific training, and therefore the peak they've reached is not quite as high as it possibly could either. So this athlete would probably need to incorporate more specific training, whereas this athlete would probably need to incorporate more general training along with their specific training. Whereas this athlete here has a large general training base, and all of that general training has been transferred to sport performance, and therefore their peak performance they reach is higher. So this is ideally how we want our athletic training to be, where we have enough general training and then we transfer all of that general training to specific sport performance training. So throughout the training cycle or the training year, we need to balance out this general and specific training in order to reach our peak at the time we need to be at our peak. So we want to make sure throughout the entire cycle or training year, we want to be performing our competition exercise. So no matter what we do, we have to perform the sport we're doing in order for all the general training to transfer. And we want to do more volume of this sort of specific training closer to when we need a peak, and probably less of it further away. In terms of our general training, we want to perform that as well through the cycle or the year in order to have transfer to our sport performance exercises. Now, the volume of our general training is probably going to be the opposite to our competition specific training. So we'll do more volume of general training further away of when we need a peak and less volume closer to when we need a peak. So if we look at this graphically, we can see that in the orange line, our general training is initially quite high to start with when we're further away from our peak, but then it gradually goes down. So when we're closer to our peak, we're not performing as much general training. And then the volume of specific training is going to increase as we get closer to that peak. So at this point, we should be able to build on this big general base that we've created and transfer all of that to specific sport performance. The last question we need to answer is, how general does our training need to get? So as we mentioned, we always want to be performing the sporting exercise, but we also want to be doing some sort of general training to transfer, as we previously discussed. So I'm going to go through an example of shot put. So on this spectrum here, we have exercises in the green here that have positive transfer to sporting performance. In the middle, no direct transfer, so not negative or positive. And then over here, we actually have negative transfer, so it actually interferes and reduces our performance of our competition exercise. So our most specific training we can do is competition weight shot put. That's the most specific we can get. No exercise is going to give us more transfer than the competition exercise. Something you can be pretty confident will have good transfer to the competition weight shot put is slightly heavier or lighter weight shot puts. So if we improve our performance with a shot put that's 50% heavier and 50% lighter, that our performance in the competition weight shot put will increase. We then have more general training like maximal strength training, which is highly likely to have some transfer to our competition exercise. Something that will have no real direct transfer to our sport performance is probably most other exercises. But for example, I've got here agility and change of direction training. Although it's maximal effort and anaerobic, it is just not specific enough in terms of the movement pattern, the force production, and the force vectors. So although it won't interfere with our shot put performance, it's also not going to improve our shot put performance. And then an example of an exercise which is likely to interfere with our shot put performance is extensive endurance training. So completely different energy systems, different movement patterns. We'll probably have fiber type shifts and other adaptations that are probably actually going to make our performance worse if we do it excessively. So in terms of a shot putter, they always want to be doing either competition weight or slightly different weight shot put, and then other exercises to transfer to that, like strength training, possibly some sort of power training, and then also some variations in the implements that they use for shot put. And that's about the spectrum of generality that we want to include in our training. So we want everything to have positive transfer. We don't want to have any neutral or negative transfer. So although it's important to include general training into our program, we still want it to be general in the sense that it will still transfer positively to sport performance. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already.